Hi, my name's Andrew and welcome to High Road. Today I start the process of building my very first guitar by creating the neck and body templates. Alright, this is going to be a tricky one to explain, as are many of my projects, but stick with me. What I'm going to build, my very first guitar, is a Telecaster, but I want a Telecaster that feels like my acoustic guitar. What do I mean by that? Well, electric guitars have very narrow string spacing compared to an acoustic. Usually the nut is about 42 millimeters, and the saddle, the string spread, is usually about 54 millimeters. On an acoustic, it's about 2 millimeters wider at the nut. It's about 44 mil, and up here it's as much as 56.5 mil. On top of that, you've got a deeper, chunkier neck profile. And often there's a little bit more space between the strings and the body of the guitar on an acoustic. Why would I do this? Well, I find that I do my best playing on an acoustic guitar. My playing is the most accurate, and when I stand and play at a gig, I find that I play most effortlessly on the acoustic. When I switch to an electric, I find that my muscle memory plays tricks on me because I'm expecting the string spacing that my acoustic has. When I switch to an electric, there's an adjustment period. Sometimes it's only a few minutes, sometimes it's a half an hour, sometimes it might be a week before I'm properly used to that guitar. And then I've got to go through the same process again when I switch back. Not every guitarist has this problem, but I do. It's just my curse. So I am going to endeavour to make an electric guitar that feels so much like my acoustic guitar that my fingers barely notice the difference. So first of all, I have to establish what those measurements will be. So I'm going to start by measuring the critical angles and the critical measurements on my acoustic. So I have a number of specifications from the Maton site as to what the measurements of this guitar should be. Now I'm going to check those now and see if my measurements confirm what the Maton site claims. So first thing is nut width. The nut width right here should be 44.1 millimeters. Interesting. I've got 43.88, 43.87, 43.9. Interesting. So I'm getting 43.90, let's call it. Alright, now the 14th fret is supposed to be 55 millimeters. So that's up here. And that is giving me 55.29. 55.29, still the same. Interesting. Okay, the next one is the fretboard radius. Maton claims this is a 12-inch radius fretboard. I've loosened off the strings, and it does seem to be accurate, yes. Yep, it's a 12-inch radius. Now because that nut width that I measured was just so different to what I was expecting, I'm going to measure it again with a couple of other comparable rulers. This is an analog one. Yeah, I'd probably say that's 43.9. And I'm just going to double check on a ruler that my calipers are measuring correctly. Looks about right. Okay. Interesting. Right, next thing I want to measure is the depth of the neck from the highest point of the fingerboard to the back of the neck, right just behind the first fret. 20.4. And the depth behind fret 9. 24.4. Right, the next thing I'm going to measure here is the string spread at the saddle. This is a tricky one. I'm actually going to measure this in 5 ways. I'm going to measure it the outside to the outside from E to E on this angle of the saddle. Then I'm going to measure it the same thing, E to E on the outside, but at 90 degrees, which would be like that. Then I'm going to measure the same two, but from the center to the center of each string, which is what you really need for a string spacing rule. And then 90 degrees, E to E, center to center. Lastly, I'm going to measure from this pin to this pin in the center. Okay, from outside to outside at about 90 degrees. We have a string spacing of 55.98 from E to E on the outside, but at the angle of the saddle we have 56.26. From the center to the center at 90 degrees we have, I'm going to call that 55.12, and then center to center on an angle 55.54, and lastly from the center of the pin to the center of the pin 56.39. Okay, good. So now I've got to transfer all this information onto a routing template. Alright, this is where the rubber hits the road. I've now got to actually make this template. So let's measure out the length of the neck. Alright, from the tip of the neck to the end of the fingerboard is about, well, it's pretty much bang on 65 centimeters. Maybe a little less, maybe 64.8. But essentially from the nut to the end of the fretboard, that's going to have to be a fixed amount, and the headstock can be, I guess, there's a bit of wiggle room in the headstock. It can be as long or as short as either side, because you're not allowed to really copy Fender headstock shapes. So I'm going to be making my own, pretty similar but not exactly the same. Okay, just going to put that to one side. This is 9mm MDF, by the way, which is usually what most people tend to use. I'm going to start by creating a center line. Now, even this part of the process has some question marks for me. I've seen lots of people make guitar templates online, but there's a lot of stuff they don't talk about in the videos. There's a lot of stuff they don't really mention. I think they take it for granted. For instance, when you draw a center line, how do you make sure that the line you've drawn is exactly the same width from start to end? What if the pencil, as you move the pencil down the line, wears slightly, and by the end of the line it may be a slightly different thickness? How do you account for that? I don't know, is the answer. I'm going to make it an arbitrary length of, say, 10 centimeters from the edge. That is the neighbour upstairs flushing the toilet. That is the nature of living in an apartment building and trying to be a YouTuber. Lovely. Okay, we're off to a good start. Alright, now I'm going to take a StewMac fret scale ruler, and I'm going to mark out on here exactly where all the frets are going to go. Now the guitar that I'm copying has 21 frets, so I'm just going to go with that. So I'm going to leave myself a little bit of space for the headstock. Now these, where I'm marking the frets, is not entirely necessary, because this is really just a guide, because the proper frets are going to be marked with a jig, so there's going to be no room for error. And I believe where the 22nd fret would be, that's going to be the end of my neck. Now when I measured my Maton, I discovered that the nut width was narrower than what the factory specifications had claimed. I have a theory about this, and this is was one of my big questions. When you use a neck template and you carve out the neck blank with that template, let's say it's 44.1, the template. When you carve out the neck blank, that'll be 44.1. But when you install the frets and then sand the edges to their final shape, I feel like you would lose some width in that sanding and finishing process. I think that's what's happening with the Maton specifications. I think they make their guitars to 44.1 millimeters, but then as the guitars are being finished and set up, I think that they lose a little bit of width along the edges with the sanding and finishing that comes with that process. So I'm going to make my guitar template 44.1, just like the Maton specs claim. And my guess is that once I've finished the neck, it will be slightly narrower than 44.1, and therefore it's going to match what the real Maton guitars turn out like. 44.1 divided by 2 equals 22.05. Now I drew my center line using the edge of this piece of MDF as a reference. So I've got to trust that is a straight line. Okay, that's my nut line. And over here, that's going to be the end of the neck. Now I've got to measure from the center of my pencil line here, which is easier said than done. It's got to be done visually. Okay, now I go at the other end. Oh, now this is a tricky one. I don't know. I don't know what the width is going to be there. I only know the width according to the Maton specs of the 14th fret. So that's here. So according to my measurements, Maton claim the 14th fret is going to be 55 millimeters. However, on my 808, it was 55.29. If I want this measurement here to be identical to my acoustic guitar, I can't cut the template to be the same width. I've got to make that a little wider, just like I did with the nut. So I'm going to take a guess here. The nut lost about 0.15 of a mil in final sanding, so I'm going to add 0.15 of a mil here. 55.3 plus 0.15 equals 55.45 divided by 2. So I'm going to go for 27.725. Going on faith that I'm going to lose about 0.15 of a millimeter in final sanding. Okay, so basically that's where my nut edge will be. I've got my 14th fret edge, and if I join that with a line, it will give me an extrapolation of where the base of the neck should be on both sides. Now here's another unknown for me. When you're working with little pencil lines like this, you can end up with a bit of a problem of shifting goalposts, I guess you call it. So I drew a center line with a pencil. Then I measured a certain distance out from that line and drew another pencil mark. Now I'm placing my ruler down on that mark, and all this is being lined up visually. And obviously I'm using a magnifying headset, but it's possible that every time I go and line up a new marking, if I'm slightly off, those little errors compound, and I could be, a fraction of a millimeter off, which just could mean that my final template is not as accurate as I'd planned. I'm not sure there's much you can do about that when you're hand building a guitar with, hand tools, but it's just something I wonder about. I'm going to have to check the final measurements and just see how close I came. Yeah, I'm happy with that. It looks like the measurement that I have taken runs directly down the very center of the pencil line. So I just have to remember that when I'm actually cutting this. If I'm going to use something to, a jig to run my router down, I'm going to have to basically split that pencil line. Alright, what I've just found is that down here, this is what I meant about the pencil accuracy. So it looks like on this side of the center line, this is perfectly 22.05 mils from the center line to the center of the outside line. Over here though, it looks like maybe this is just a pencil error, but from the center of this line to the center of that line is a little bit more. So it's actually the inside of this line to the center of this one, which gives me my perfect 22.05. So I'm actually going to write down here 22.05 inside, just as a reminder to cut to the inside edge of that pencil line, and then over here 22.05 center. This one seems to be perfect. This one here, there's a little discrepancy, so I've always wondered about this. I've always wondered, how do people accurately get these things perfect? Maybe they don't, maybe they just discover their own little errors like this and allow for it. Okay, now I need a headstock. I want to draw in either the headstock or where the tuners are going to go. But I can't just copy that directly from my Telecaster, because my Telecaster has different string spacing to what this will have. So if I just put the tuner holes in their normal spots, it's not going to have dead accurate straight string pull, which is what I want it to have. So I need to kind of do some checking. I need to put the actual bridge. By the way, this is a special bridge that I bought. It's a vintage spaced bridge. It's very wide compared to a normal Fender width. This actually matches the width of my acoustic string spacing at the bridge. So I'm going to sort of just place that roughly where it would go, which is about 650 mil or 65 centimeters from the nut. Okay. Alright, now what I'm trying to do here is I'm going to try and draw a line that reflects each string's trajectory all the way down the template to where the tuning peg would be. So to do that, I need to put a little mark where each of these screws would be and use that as the starting point for that trajectory. I'm also down here at the nut end, I'm going to have to mark in the string spacing. So that's got to be done now, so that it accurately, the line that I'm going to draw is going to accurately line up with the tuner. Now remember, the reason I'm trying to be this accurate and think this far ahead is so that I get perfectly accurate string pull. At this point, even if I get this stuff wrong, it can be changed later. Now, although I've measured the nut width, I haven't measured the string spacing here at the nut. So for that we use a string spacing rule, and these little markers have see-through cutouts on them, so you can actually just check where the spring spread lines up with the ruler. Now I've already done this, and I've actually worked out that it's from there to there, so it's actually every second mark. That top E, B, G, D, A, E string. So I place it over the existing nut. That's what I get. Now you might be wondering, why do you even need to use a string spacing rule at all? Why don't you just simply mathematically work out what would be an equal distance between each string and be done with it? Well, you could do that, but in fact if you cut the nut with each slot at the same distance from the next, the strings would have different amounts of gap between them, because the thicker strings would have a smaller gap than the thinner strings. So by using a string spacing rule, this actually shifts the nut slots so that the strings have a more equal distance between them. So they're not actually equally spaced, they're unequally spaced so that the space between the strings is equal, if that makes sense. Okay, now I need to transfer these string spacing marks onto my neck template at the nut. Now I need to join up my saddle marks with my nut marks, and that should give me an accurate representation of my string pull. Right, let's see what we've got here. This is the nut, that's the center line, E string, A string, D string, G, B, E. Really I just want to determine where the tuners are going to go via these lines. I should point out, I've just checked on my Tele there, and although Fenders are supposed to have perfectly straight string pull, it's not actually perfect. There is a little bit of wiggle on some strings. So I'm aiming to improve on that. I'm aiming to try and get that as good as it can possibly be. I don't know if you can see here, but the bottom E string definitely pulls slightly inwards when it leaves the nut there. The others seem to be reasonably straight, but that one there is definitely not. It's the next day, and I've been taking a look at my work, and I think I've noticed a couple of little problems which I can fix before I move on. Firstly, you may have noticed that when I marked out the screw positions on the bridge yesterday, something didn't look quite right, and I think I figured out why. What I didn't realise is these screws actually have a little bit of movement in them. See that? So I probably shouldn't be using these screws as a marking reference at all. Maybe the holes that they're inside of, but not the screws. So I might see if I can use these holes drilled in the back, which should line up the same. This may also mean that I have to redraw some of my string lines from yesterday. This, by the way, I think these are some little oil marks from the tuners, which I left them laying on the wood overnight, and I think there's a little bit of oil that's seeped out, so I'm hoping it's just cosmetic. It's not going to really affect anything. So now that I've remarked these positions, I can see that the ones I did yesterday, based off the screw holes, were actually pretty inaccurate. So I'm going to have to redo some of the work from yesterday. Okay, I've redrawn these string trajectories now, and I've marked out roughly where the tuning pegs should go. That diagonal line is where they should line up with. So now my job is to try and actually see if they'll fit along that line. Okay, let's talk about the dilemma that I've got here in regards to straight string pull. Now, in an ideal world, I would place each tuning peg exactly where it needed to go in relation to these string trajectories that I've drawn. So I'd just place that exactly where it would fall along that line. I'd place this one exactly where it would fall along that line, and that would be done. But if I did that, these tuning pegs would all have slightly different positions like that, and it would look a little bit wrong. It wouldn't look like a straight line of tuners, which is what it's kind of got to look like. So I think what's going to end up happening here is a bit of a compromise. The only things I can really control are the position of the first and last tuning peg. In between, those ones are going to be chosen for me by the straight line. So I've got to be very careful how I choose this one and this one. I can't just place these the same way they would be placed for a normal Telecaster, because my string spread is different. So if I line them up like a normal Telecaster, they're all going to pull to the left or the right, or it's not going to be straight. So these are my preferred strings, Elixir 11 to 49s, and if we look on the back, we can see the string gauges listed here. So bottom E string is 0.049 of an inch, or 1.24 millimeters. What this means is I have to take this number, divide it in 2, and add that distance as a little buffer between the string line and the edge of the post, because that will reflect the width of the string as it winds around the tuning peg. I'm happy enough to do this in inches. There we go. 0.49. So I've marked out where I want my bottom E string tuner to be located, and now I just need to take the caliper measurement that I've created for this. This represents my bottom E string, and I need to split that line right in half and mark the edge of this jaw. That will be half the width of the string, and that is where the edge of my tuning peg hole should go. So now I've got to do the same thing with the top E string. So according to this, I'm looking at 0.11 inches or 0.28 millimeters. This is such a small distance. It's probably, thinner than a pencil width. We're talking almost nothing there, so I'm just going to go with about a pencil width. Okay, I've been getting a bit confused here because I haven't been able to get all these tuners to fit the way they should. These are actually locking tuners, so I actually just unscrewed the tips of each one and laid them out directly on the template, and I found out something interesting. When I line them up exactly where they're supposed to be, along that diagonal line where they intersect with the string trajectories, I get graduated spacing between the tuning pegs. So string 6 has a wider spacing to string 5 than what these do. Now, I've never seen a Telecaster or a Stratocaster with graduated spacing like this, but mathematically maybe this is what they should have if you want properly straight string pull. So it's starting to dawn on me that maybe Telecasters and Stratocasters, if you use traditional tuners, you're never actually going to have properly straight string pull. It's always going to be pretty close but never exactly straight. And I'll admit, if I look at my Telecaster here, I can see that the strings aren't properly straight. You can see that string 5 pulls away at a slightly different angle to the strings either side of it. But cosmetically, you really don't see much difference. They look parallel to the naked eye, somewhat. And for all intents and purposes, maybe it's straight enough. It's starting to look more like a guitar template now. I've marked the positions for strings 1 and 6, and essentially the entire headstock shape is tilted like about 1 degree that way compared to a normal Fender because of the wider string spacing. So simply by tilting all of the tuners a little bit that way, it spreads them a bit wider and gives me the right angles, I'm hoping. Next thing I need to do is change this design here so that it's similar to a Tele but not the same, because I don't want to be in trouble for copyright breaches with Fender, and also I kind of want to do something of my own. So these are called French curves, and they're a common device used for drawing curved shapes and designing. I believe these are like an infinite analog curve shape, so you can pretty much get any kind of radius curve you want if you play with it enough. And I've got various different kinds here. Okay, there you go. That is my headstock. Well, now that all of the design work is done, the only thing left to do is to put my money where my mouth is and start cutting this shape out. Apologies, I didn't have the camera switched on just now. I just cut the template out very roughly with a jigsaw, and now I need to go around this and neaten it up with a router and a bobbin sander. So in order to cut out this template really cleanly, there's about 4 surfaces on here that have to have a completely straight edge. Obviously each side of the fingerboard, the base, and the top edge of that headstock. So to do that, I need a straight edge jig that I can run my router along. Now this is a commercially available straight edge which you might buy from a hardware store. This one was about 20 bucks. And these are usually used by construction workers. Often use these when they're ripping plywood boards. They run a circular saw along one edge of this to keep it straight. Now that I have these Crimson Guitars straight edges, I've actually checked how straight my hardware store one is, and it's not as straight as I thought. There's actually little gaps and undulations along the surface there, which, you know, when you're cutting plywood, that stuff doesn't matter, but when you're making a guitar, it does matter a little bit more. So I'm actually going to use something else. I'm going to use an offcut of MDF, which is already straighter than my commercial straight edge, and I'm going to use a sanding beam just to tidy it up a little bit, and then that's going to be as straight as anything really, and that'll be really good for running my router along. This is 120 grit adhesive sandpaper that I got from StewMac. I'm going to put some on there and then trim the edges. So I'm laying my straight edge down here on the table next to a sheet of MDF, and I'm using this a bit like a shooting board where I'm moving the MDF, and this assures me of getting a nice square 90-degree angle on the face of this piece. Alright, I've checked this piece now with the straight edge and it's about as straight as it can be, so that's fantastic. So here's my straight edge, and this is just a scrap piece with a fairly rough cut. I'm going to use this as a practice piece. I'm going to clamp these together using the masking tape and super glue trick. Okay, I'm glad I cut that test piece because I've learnt two things. First of all, it's cut this reasonably straight, but it does have little undulations which I can feel with my finger. So any piece that I cut is going to need more sanding, so I was right about making the template a little bit bigger than the final piece. Second thing I've learned is that when you run the router bit along the template for the first time, it actually compresses the end grain of the MDF a little bit, and this has left a small indentation in the template. Now, I called the store I bought my router bit from and they said this is normal, but it only happens once. It compresses the end grain just once and then it's permanently like that. So what I need to do to prepare my template for future cutting, I need to run the bearing along there so that it compresses and then it's basically ready for cutting in the future. Alright, time for the real thing. So I've placed this template as accurately as I can. You might remember that over here at the nut I'd planned to take the entire pencil line, whereas down at the base end I'm just taking half the pencil line. So I'm hoping this just works first time. Okay, that's looking pretty tidy. Before I go and cut my next line, I'm just going to double check that I am where I'm supposed to be. Okay, looks like I am, but I'm probably going to have to take the whole pencil line there to be right on the money. I'd kind of like to leave a bit of wiggle room, to be honest, so I'll probably only take half the line. And then I'll sand my way up to the measurement that I want. The straight routes are done now. I'm just going to check and see how accurate the cuts are. So the nut is supposed to be 44.1, It's coming in at 44.38. So that leaves me a bit of room there, and I can sand that back a little bit. 14th fret is supposed to be 55.45. And it's currently 55.61, so that's pretty darn close as well. Again, I can sand that to get that where it needs to be. Nailed it. 1/100th of a millimeter too far. That's alright. Okay, the crucial measurements now are right where they need to be. The nut and the 14th fret are perfect. So now I can do some shaping. I like using sanding beams as opposed to planers because you can gradually creep up on the angles or the measurements that you want. It's very slow and gradual and controlled, whereas I feel like with planes, which I see a lot of other luthiers using, maybe you don't have quite that degree of control. Well, not with that experience anyway. Yeah, good, there we are. So now that the base is perfectly square to the center line, and now that the sides of the fingerboard here are absolutely perfect, now I've just got to cut these curves on a bobbin sander, and I've also got to put a radius on these two corners here. Now, in order to get the right radius on these two corners, you have to match whatever the neck pocket is. Now, neck pockets are traditionally routed with a 3/8 router bit. So what I've done is I've bought a 3/8 bearing, which is a spare one for that router, and I'm going to place it on the corners and use this as a little tiny curve template. Well, it's finished. I'm really happy with how this has turned out. It looks cool. Well, there it is, the finished neck template. I've measured every part of it and it's pretty much perfect to about 1/100th of a millimeter. Time will tell whether that translates onto the guitar neck the way I hope it will, but it's great. Couldn't be happier. This is going to be a much easier process than making the neck, because all I really need to do is trace around this existing guitar body and then make allowances later for the neck pocket. So there it is, beautiful shape. my absolute all-time favorite electric guitar shape. Now what I'm going to have to do to this in order to make it fit my neck template is I'm going to have to modify the neck pocket area a little bit, but I do want to put some of my own character onto this, and because this is a Telecaster based on the neck dimensions and the string spacing of an acoustic guitar, I'm going to take some inspiration from that acoustic guitar. I think I'm going to try and redesign this little horn area here to kind of have a softer curve the way that one does. You might notice that I think there's some Godin models that have a similar sort of a curve shape going on. I think they're very attractive guitars. So I'm going to have a bit of a go with the French curves again and see if I can come up with something unique that I like just there. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy with this. As you can see, it's just a small modification on that horn to make it my own. It's a gentler curve, a little bit like the way an acoustic cutaway is a little bit gentler, which sort of reflects the acoustic heart and soul of the design. And when we pair that with the neck, I reckon it's a pretty good looking guitar. Now I just need to modify the neck pocket area to accommodate the slightly wider neck that I've made. So I'm going to start by drawing a center line and then measuring out from there. Okay, here's the final neck pocket area redesigned. Essentially, a standard Telecaster neck is about 2 millimeters narrower at the heel than what I've designed. So I had to reaccommodate these curves and just redraw this whole area after I had the center line in place. It took quite a while to kind of figure out where the center line was going to go. But yeah, I think I've got it right. In the end, even if I cut this to shape and it's wrong, I can still make adjustments and sand things into a final shape later. So, good enough for a template. Something I've just sort of thought of before I cut out the final template is I've got to make sure that the edge of the template lines up perfectly with the edge of the scratch plate. I'm going to be modifying the scratch plate anyway around here, but where the scratch plate runs along here and around that area, it's got to be completely parallel with the body. So I've located the center line points of the scratch plate and lined it up. I think what I'm going to do is drop it down like that. Just redraw that shape. So now the line of the template should follow the line of the scratch plate a little bit more closely there. Now, the only bit of this template that really has to be perfectly square, well, it doesn't have to be, but I'd like it to be, is the edge of the neck pocket. I'd like that to be square to the center line. You really don't need very much glue at all to hold the tape down. Alright, and let's do it. Lay it on the line. And okay. Well, it's a straight cut, but this is what happens when you don't set the blade to the perfectly right depth. It leaves that furry line there. And I've also cut into my work table a little bit. Okay, all the main outside edges are done. I've just got to tackle the neck pocket area with a smaller spindle. Now that's the smallest bobbin I've got, and that's as close as I can get into that curve, so I'm not sure if what I'm going to do there. That's about as close as I can get. I might just leave it. I mean, it doesn't look bad. The only way I could get any tighter there is maybe with maybe hand tools or files, something like that. Okay, nearly done. I'm just going to touch some of this up by hand. I'm just checking the area around the neck pocket here, and what I can see is that there's a little bit of overhang either side, and I think I'm happy to leave that there even on the template, because I feel like that can be adjusted on the real final guitar body once the neck is made. Well, the body template's finished now, and I've just clamped it together with the neck template, and that's kind of what it's going to look like in the end, I guess. I like it. It's cool.